Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about smuggling, the smuggling of people across borders. The people that do smuggling are called many things, including smugglers, guides, coyotes, and traffickers. My guest today spent nearly 7 years following and interviewing smugglers from the southern border in Chiapas to the northern border with the United States. My guest is Jason DeLeon. Jason DeLeon is a professor of Anthropology and Chicano Studies and director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also the executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, and he is the author of the book that he joins us to talk about. It's called Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. Jason DeLeon, it is my good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's begin with terminology. You take these words, I said there are many things we call smugglers, including traffickers, and you take this issue straight on right at the beginning of your book about the difference and about the different meanings and perhaps how this gets into our perception of who smugglers are. Talk to me about the difference between the meaning of these two words, smuggling and trafficking.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. You know, people who are trafficked have that happen against their will, right? So what that means is, it's through fraud, through coercion, through force. People who are being smuggled typically are paying that person for the services of getting them across, a geopolitical boundary. It doesn't mean that you can't hire a smuggler to get you across the border and then they end up tricking you and traffic you instead, right? So there's some fluidity there, but most of the time, people who are migrating clandestinely, they are actively paying a smuggler to get them to where they want to go. And so it's you could think about a smuggler in the context of human migration is providing a service, whereas a trafficker, is basically it's not necessarily a service, but it's and both smuggling and trafficking can be smuggling can be exploitative, but not necessarily. Trafficking is 100% exploitative, and so it's really happening against people's will. And I think that those things get confused sometimes because people get hurt, people die when they're getting smuggled, and depending on the scenario, it could be, a smuggler makes a mistake and people die, or it could be a smuggler decides to traffic someone instead against their will, and then they die or get hurt or something. And so there's this kind of back and forth that can occur. But really, at the end of the day, we should think about them as two very distinct kinds of things. And I think the problem when we conflate them is that then we misunderstand what the role of the smuggler actually is. We should think about the smuggler in most instances of migration as a service provider.
I think the term that we're probably most commonly used to today is coyotes. A coyote, somebody who assists people getting really into the United States, but really also getting into Mexico and through Mexico. And we're going to talk more about that. But talk to me about how you see how our perception is pretty negative of what we call coyotes.
Yep. And I think, people from the outside, we have this negative perception because we only hear about smuggling when it goes bad. We only hear about smugglers when something really catastrophic happens. But for a lot of migrants, their relationship with the smuggler, with the coyote, is not it's not a negative one. I mean, it's one where they're trying to find a good smuggler who can get them to where they want to go. You don't hear, but those aren't stories that you hear in the media. This smuggler gets a family of 10 out of Honduras and into the United States. I mean, you don't hear those kinds of stories. But when people die in the back of a truck, you hear about that, and then the first person to blame becomes the smuggler. And obviously, the smuggler, plays a huge role when people die in those scenarios. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, why do people need smugglers in the first place, right? Why are they in the back of a truck? Those are the types of questions I think we need to be asking to kind of better unpack this this occupation of smuggler. Because I think for me, another big issue is that we spend so much time and energy talking about undocumented migration, and yet we don't know much about smuggling. We never really talk about it, despite the fact that you can't have clandestine migration without a smuggler. I mean, they are a crucial part of this industry, but I think really poorly understood.
You spent, as I said in my introduction, nearly 7 years following smugglers, getting to know them. You document the lives of about six of them in your book. How does one get into doing that?
For me, it was kind of by accident. I wasn't really intending to do this project, and I was in Mexico, kind of getting ready to shift gears and think about other research topics outside of migration. And I ended up just meeting a bunch of young guys on the train tracks in southern Mexico, a bunch of guys from Honduras who were all involved in smuggling. And, it was through some kind of general conversations. I met these dudes on the train tracks. I started talking about anthropology. I had just written a book about migrants. And one of these kids, this young guy named Roberto just says to me, "Why don't you talk to us? Nobody ever asks smugglers, coyotes, guias about our stories. People just think we're the bad guys, but it's a lot more complicated than that." And and that was kind of an interesting question posed to me. Well, why don't people ask you about your lives? And so I said, well, let's see what happens. And I started interviewing folks, and it became very clear right away that nobody had ever listened to them. And so a lot of the guys I worked with found it, this kind of the first time in their entire lives that they felt like their stories were important. And people just immediately opened up to me about so many things. I mean, to a level that was so surprising. Like, I mean, I'm talking, it was like less than a day before this door kind of opened for me, and then just led me on this path for 7 years. But it was as simple as me saying, "Okay, I'm here to listen, and I want to understand." And then suddenly all these doors just opened.
You mentioned Hondurans. Honduras and Hondurans are an important part of this story.
Yep. Most of the folks that I work with, actually, I would say all the folks that I worked with were coming from Honduras, and they were helping other Hondurans get across the length of Mexico. And the smugglers that I worked with tended to be two sort of groups of folks, young people, so late teens, early 20s, who had been in smuggling for a few years, and had gang affiliations, and were increasingly over the last 15 years, transnational gangs like MS-13 and the Bloods have become really an important. I mean, they basically control the migrant trail in a lot of ways, and they become the go-betweens with the drug cartels who now tax migrants at different places. And so, I met all these young guys from Honduras who were gang affiliated and were now starting to get involved in smuggling. And then the other part of that were these more sort of senior, veteran smugglers. And by senior or veteran, we're talking folks in their early to mid 30s. If you're in smuggling, in your 30s still, it means you've been pretty lucky. But most folks don't last that long. I mean, you either die, you go to jail, or if you can, you try to get out. And so the book really is about these two groups of folks, these young folks who feel like there is some hope of getting away from this life, and then there's these guys in their 30s who they want to get away from it, but feel like they've just been wrapped up in criminal activities for so long that perhaps there is no way for them to escape.
There's a whole business around this, and not just the underground economy, but also the business of immigration enforcement. That's all tied up.
100%. I think we tend to think about smuggling as happening in a vacuum, right? That these smugglers fall out of the sky and then, they just sort of go and do this work. But we need to think about anytime something changes in border enforcement, the world of smuggling adjusts in ways to help people get around border enforcement practices, but also as a way to make money from it. And we can think about it as in the inverse too. These billion-dollar global border enforcement industries, they need smuggling to exist so that they can justify themselves in these bloated kinds of budgets. And so when one makes an adjustment here, the other one makes an adjustment there, and both sides are profiting from the needs of migrants, and from these labor markets that are pulling people into different countries. So it's a huge business, and I think we need to think about it. Smuggling is a symptom of capitalism in a lot of ways, and it's not I don't think it's the problem to be addressed. I think it is a symptom of these much bigger issues that are at play. But it's very easy to demonize the smuggler. It's very easy to focus on that, and then not talk about climate change, not talk about capitalism and all these other things that are really the issues that are fueling this problem in general.
In some ways, this reminds me of drugs and the drug trade as well. What happens is you have both sides are profiting off, just not off each other and what encountering each other's moves, but they actually spur even further profits, right? It becomes more, I mean, you were just saying the gangs are now taxing people that are migrating up through Mexico.
Yeah, I mean it's a nonstop cycle. I mean, one of the things that I really came to understand was that as long as there are places in the world that are unlivable, and they are increasingly becoming more and more unlivable because of things like climate change, there's always going to be smuggling. There's always going to be money to be made from it, and it's this vicious cycle, and it just keeps feeding itself. And you look around globally, the response to climate change, unfortunately, to climate change, to gang violence, to the drug wars, the response by the global north has been to harden its borders. But that is not, I mean, that's just like putting a band-aid and ignoring these kind of root problems. And so we keep putting band-aids on these things, and we're not addressing the root causes of these things. And I think globe trying to solve this problem at our borders, which it's not a border issue. It's much bigger than that.
Is smuggling of humans, people who are trying to migrate from Central America up to the United States and needing smugglers or coyotes, whatever term people want to use, is this a newer phenomenon, or is there a long history of this?
It's got a really, really deep history. I mean, people have been getting smuggled across the U.S.-Mexico border since that border started. The difference, what has happened is it used to be kind of a mom and pop industry. And as the drug cartels and transnational organizations have gotten more interested in it, as borders have hardened as well, it's become a different kind of industry. And I remember, this is probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a court case in San Diego where this woman had been indicted in federal court for running this human smuggling ring for, it seemed like, several generations. And she was a grandmother who was put on trial. And one of the things I remember from the news report was she said, for 30 or 40 years, I've been doing this job and nobody ever got hurt under my watch. I was always trying to help families and get them across the border to where they can get better jobs and they can support themselves and the ones that they care about. And I think, obviously that's not always the case, but they're definitely, in those days, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, people were going to the local smuggler in their communities, people that they had connections to, social ties to, potentially kinship ties to, and they were paying that person to get them to the U.S. And they trusted those people because if something bad happened, they knew who to go and talk to about it, and they knew that these social networks would help kind of protect the client because it wasn't this anonymous kind of transaction. That has all changed, and now that smuggling has gotten so much more violent, now that the cartels are involved and that these transnational gangs are involved, you need a new type of smuggler. A smuggler who is gang affiliated, a smuggler who is willing to do the kind of most dangerous and brutal things that are required to negotiate with those individuals. And so that has changed, I think, the dynamic in many ways. And so it's no longer this kind of mom and pop kind of industry. It's really this much more violent and intense kind of industry that requires a kind of new breed of smuggler. And so a big part of the book is just about how these young guys that I work with, they come from these impoverished backgrounds. They're failed migrants with gang affiliations, and they've been around violence their whole lives. And they found a way to use this violence in a profitable way. Being able to perpetuate violence against those who want to abuse their clients makes them a better smuggler in a lot of ways for these folks.
It's important that you have to be
Yeah,
you have to be willing to commit violence in order to be a smuggler.
100%. And that was not the case 20 years, 30 years ago.
Why? Why do you have to, not 20, 30 years ago, but why is violence important for a smuggler to be able to use?
Because there are so many more people now who are just lying in wait for these migrants to show up so that they can rob them, abuse them, assault them, kidnap them. And so you need someone who, who can protect you from those things because, 20 years ago, the migrants would get robbed and assaulted occasionally, but now I mean it's like you're just expecting it to happen at practically every stop on the journey. And so you need a person who's armed, who's willing to carry a machete or a gun, who can ward off these other criminal elements. And you'll hear people, the smugglers I talk to. There's one of the main guys that I write about, named Kingston. He says, it's just gotten so bad now that, like, in order for this to work, you have to be down to do the worst kinds of things if you want to be successful. And also for those smugglers, if you don't want to die yourself, you need to be able to protect your group and everyone in it.
So it's not just getting people through a geographic terrain and how to get there or how to get even by the U.S. Border Patrol. It's much, much more than that.
Yeah, no, it's getting you past people who are more than willing to kidnap you, extort you, kill you and put you in a ditch. It's just very, very scary. And I spend a lot of time with folks, with the smugglers who are sort of getting through that kind of gauntlet, and then getting to know people who, their job was to just sit around and wait for a group to show up. And if they hadn't paid the head tax to get through, those folks were more than willing to do some pretty horrific kinds of things. And it became clear to me that the experiences of migrants is becoming more and more brutal and more violent. And so in response, the smuggling industry has to account for that.
Are these, and there are many people who are trying to get into the United States through Mexico who are from all over the world. But are you finding predominantly these are Honduran smugglers smuggling Hondurans?
In the work that I was doing, yeah, it was really Hondurans smuggling other Hondurans across the length of Mexico. And then once you get to the U.S.-Mexico border, those clients are handed off to Mexican smugglers who then get you across the Rio Grande or through the Sonoran Desert. But it's this kind of chain of events that's happening. And even with the Honduran smugglers, I worked with two groups. I worked with these mestizo, fair-skinned Hondurans who are smuggling other fair-skinned Hondurans. And then I spent a significant amount of time with Afro-Honduran, Garifuna speakers who, essentially, black Hondurans who are smuggling other black Hondurans. And, they would tell you that getting across Mexico, depending on if you're black or white, Venezuelan or, there's different routes. People are going to different places.
You're perceived differently.
100%. And, being a black migrant in Mexico is a much different experience than being a white Honduran migrant crossing Mexico. And so people need a smuggler who understands those things and who can help kind of mitigate those the different kinds of experiences that people are likely to have.
Is this made even more dangerous because these are not Mexicans that are actually trying to get across the border in this story?
Yeah.
These are, Mexico's a foreign country to these people that are trying to get through.
100%. And the U.S. has long been deeply invested in helping Mexico to stop other migrants from crossing that country. And so I spent time, with U.S. Border Patrol agents in Mexico, in Honduras, and they were there to train Mexican immigration forces. They were there to train Honduran forces to stop their, other Hondurans from getting across, the length of Mexico. And so it's, getting through Mexico, as you said, it's not just the environment, it's not just the jungles, it's not just it's law enforcement, it's, the people getting deported, all the different criminal elements who are seeking to exploit migrants, and then just also a general hostility that Mexico has against other migrants. And, it is difficult. I mean, there are black Mexicans, especially in the Gulf Coast, but they're a pretty small minority, and there's a significant amount of racism in Mexico against indigenous people, both indigenous Mexicans and indigenous people from farther south, but also, significant amount of racism against Black people. And so now you've got Haitians, you've got Africans, you've got all these folks who are crossing Mexico and having to deal with, with just this more general, hostility against those folks.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Jason DeLeon, who's a professor of anthropology at UCLA and the author of the book that we're in conversation about called Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. You write an important moment in time is towards the end of the Barack Obama presidency in 2015. Is this when we start seeing and getting a lot of news coverage about caravans?
Yes.
Coming through Mexico from Honduras up to the United States? Well, what's important to know about 2015?
So 2015 is about a year after the moment, right? There, I mean, again, God, it feels like it's 10 years ago, right? But there was this
almost
moment,
is.
right? I mean, it's just a crazy thing. But in 2014, for a hot minute, there were all of these images of unaccompanied minors from Honduras, in these Mylar, blankets in these detention centers, these places kind of overrun with all these little kids fleeing Honduras. And the U.S. for a second pays attention to it, like, oh my God, this is a humanitarian crisis. What's going on? Obama comes out and says, don't worry, we've secured the border, problem is solved. What really had happened is Mexico launches this program called Plan Frontera Sur in 2014, which is a security program that is intended to stop the flow of Central American migrants across Mexico. And the U.S. is partially funding it, is putting a lot of pressure on Mexico to do this thing. And so suddenly it used to take a month to get across the length of Mexico. By 2015, it can now take a month just to get out of the southern state of Chiapas. And so suddenly it becomes so much harder because of a rise in law enforcement, which is coupled with the rise in general exploitation of migrants and extortion by law enforcement, by criminal organizations. And so all these migrants now who can't even get out of Chiapas find that they have a new target on them. And so the caravans develop as a way to protect these folks, because now suddenly, if you're in a group of 3, it's easy to disappear. But if you're in a group of 300, it's much harder for people to come after you, supposedly, although people are still getting attacked and kidnapped and pulled out of those groups. But the caravans really develop in response to this increase in border enforcement security that Mexico and the U.S. are starting to do. And that's, you periodically will have these caravans coming up. I mean, people think about it as like, oh, we're suddenly being invaded. There's this mass of people coming for us. But it really is about personal security and strength in numbers.
And so so they're forcing, and Mexico does try to crack down as well on migration across the border. This is a long terrain from Chiapas all the way to the southern border in Chiapas all the way to the northern border. Tell me about this trip. Is it one guide that takes you the entire trip? Do they hand people off?
It depends. Yeah. I mean, it's 2,000 kilometers of Mexico, right? And that's like jungle, desert, urban zones. If you're lucky, you meet someone in Honduras and you say, okay, I want to go to the U.S. And they say, I'll get you across Mexico for $10,000, $12,000. Most people don't have money. Like it's so much money. And so they might say, well, give me half up front and then give me the other half sort of at the end. That's best case scenario, that then you're with the same guide all the way across Mexico. What really ends up happening is people leave Honduras in the middle of the night because they're being extorted by gangs, they're being threatened, all these things, if someone's been killed in their family, and so they're running for their lives. So they leave without a guide. They show up, at the at the Guatemala-Mexico border, and they meet some, punk kid who says, hey, I can get you to the town of Pacalna, which is a couple 100 kilometers from Guatemala, but it's into the interior for, $300 per person. And so people, that's what maybe they have barely that. So they pay that person gets them to Pacalna. and then now they're stuck there because they're out of money, and so they've got to wait for another wire transfer from a relative in the U.S. Perhaps if they're lucky, maybe they'll pick up some undocumented labor in that town, make a few bucks under the table, getting paid cheap slave wages, save up enough money, another couple $100, meet some new random person who says, I can get you to Veracruz, 300 kilometers away. Pay that person, start the whole process again. And so some of these folks, I mean, they're crossing Mexico. It can take months or even years to get enough just to get to the U.S.-Mexico border. And keep in mind, that's the Honduran experience. Folks coming from Venezuela or elsewhere, they've potentially, Haiti, they've been migrating for probably years. And so it's a really long, drawn out process. And most of the guys, or a lot of the guys that I worked with, were the lowest level of the smuggler. And so they kind of specialize in really short segments of the journey. Guatemala to Pacalna, or up to Mexico City, and then they would stop and then double back. But the smugglers themselves in those instances, they're not making very much money. They're making probably less than minimum wage if you start to factor out the amount of hours that they are working on this thing and the amount of days that it takes to get from point A to point B. But yeah, a lot of people are doing it now kind of piecemeal.
And as you're saying, people are being taxed by the gangs. Are smugglers working for themselves, or are they working for a gang?
They have to, these smugglers are in gangs, and they have to answer to someone in their gang and pay that person. So if they bring in a group of 5, they've got to pay for those 5 people. But a lot of the guys that I was working with were getting out of smuggling now because what they were finding was that the cartels were taxing them too. And so that they were having to pay a head tax and saying, like, now I'm losing money to do this kind of thing, which is then why the prices start to go up, because now the cartels, I mean, they don't care. They just will keep
levels
taxing
to this.
Yeah,
there's a gang, and then there's the cartel.
100%. Yeah. And so, if you don't have an affiliation, if you don't have a connection with those folks, it's very easy to get in trouble quickly, because some folks will, this is the problem with contracting a smuggler that you don't know, that's not from your home community. You just meet some punk kid on the street who says, I can get you to, to Pacalna or wherever it is. And they might tell you, yeah, I know the cartels, I've already paid, we're good to go. But they're just trying to pocket that money. And then you get to a place like Pacalna in southern Chiapas, and they grab you and they go, well, how come you haven't paid the fees? And this kid is like, well, I don't know, didn't do it. And they will do something kind of terrible to that person, but they might look at the clients too and go, oh, we're going to do the same thing to you, extort you, traffic you, whatever it is, because you haven't paid. And it's not those migrants' fault. They didn't know. They believed this smuggler, who was trying to convince him that everything was taken care of, and in reality, nothing was taken care of.
And again, what's making this so expensive and seen as business opportunities, not deterrents, is actually the anti-migration policies that are being enacted throughout Mexico as well as at the U.S. border.
Oh, 100%. Any one of these little adjustments, anytime we make it harder for people to cross, it's more money. And I think people need to ask themselves, how bad must it be in a place like Honduras that your best option is to take you and your family, to trust some stranger to get you across this violent maze of danger through Mexico? Like what's going on in these home countries that's making those places so unlivable? And also, what is pulling people to the United States, right? I mean, we have this insatiable desire in this country for cheap immigrant labor. And so we're pulling those folks here, and we're saying, hey, if you can survive this gauntlet in Mexico, if you can get through this horrific death trap in the Sonora Desert of Arizona, once you get to the United States, we will completely then ignore you and allow you to work under, in the shadows, so that we can benefit from your labor. All of this is kind of happening in the background, and I think we need to think about those things when we talk about smuggling and undocumented migration. That there's all these other pieces and things that are at work.
Trains are an important part of this story. Is it through trains that people mostly travel from the south to the north of Mexico?
It used to be, and Mexico has really cracked down on these trains. It used to be like hundreds of migrants would get on top of these freight trains and work their way kind of north. Starting around 2014, private security companies started putting police on these trains, started really, shooting at migrants and all these human rights abuses. Um, and then they started shutting down different segments of these train routes, so people aren't able to use them as much as they used to. They're still using them to some extent, but what is happening is the train tracks themselves become the path. And so maybe you're not riding on top of the train, but you're using the train tracks as a guide to kind of figure out how to get farther north. And so there's these industries that have popped up all along the train tracks, migrant safe houses, places for people to buy food, to buy Honduran food, right? There's lots of people in Mexico who now specialize in cooking food that Hondurans and other folks really are looking for. There's a whole bunch of industries that have developed out of this incredibly long, journey.
I guess it's controversial to say this, but it might be interesting to think about. Some may compare it to the Underground Railroad. Of course, we're talking about slavery in the 19th century.
Yeah.
But tell me about that comparison, how you view it.
People are starting to make that comparison, and I think it's an important one to think about because, um, you know, it's not just we need to think about all the reasons that people are running away. I mean, and there's a moment in the book where I interview this kind of special force, this Honduran special force that the U.S. directly supports and equips, and I'm interviewing these soldiers who are saying to me, "Yeah, I get it. I arrest these kids because they're leaving the country without their parents or without permission, and so we catch them and send them back. And I recognize that we are sending them back potentially to die. They're telling me I'm starving at home or that the gangs are going to kill me." And then these soldiers are saying, "I get that, but the law is the law. The U.S. is supporting us to do this, and so we're going to keep sending these folks back." And so those folks are running for their lives, and everybody knows it. And these smugglers um, recognize that. I mean, and some of the smugglers I interviewed would talk about how they see their work as good. They're doing something good. They're providing a service. They're also making money off of it. And there were people in the Underground Railroad who were also profiting from that as well, going around collecting fees, collecting donations to kind of support that work. And so I think we need to think about smuggling as not just this exploitative industry, which it is, but I mean, these are migrants who are being sent to the U.S. to then play a major role in an exploitative labor market in the U.S. as well. And so they're just being exploited kind of at every part of this journey. But a lot of the folks who are moving them see them as providing a kind of life-saving service and getting them out of the dangers that often exist in places like Haiti or in Honduras.
I mean, it makes me want to do a deeper dive back into the Underground Railroad. Of course, we get this very benevolent history, which it was a benevolent thing. We're not arguing against that. We're not casting judgment on people that are being guides to get people from one place to other now. But it would be abnormal to think back in the 19th century that people didn't actually take advantage of a desperate people that were trying to escape underground.
Yeah. Yeah. I think 100%. I mean, unfortunately, it feels like it's often part of our nature, and I hate to it's like I'm flogging this horse of capitalism, but if there's money to be made, it just feels like people are always willing to do that in some, and justify it in some way, shape, or form. Even if there are benefits to this thing that's happening, there's also, people want to turn a little bit of a profit.
Jason DeLeon is our guest. Jason DeLeon is professor of anthropology and Chicano studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and author of the book Soldiers and Kings, Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. Again, Jason DeLeon, you have chronicled the lives of 6 different smugglers in this book. You begin by writing about Roberto Paredes. Can you tell me about him?
Roberto was a young kid. He was one of the first smugglers that I met in this little town called Pacalna in southern Chiapas. And, he was someone who was trying to get away from smuggling. He had come from a very difficult kind of background, who grew up incredibly poor and disadvantaged, raised around a whole lot of violence. He had a history of drug abuse, but he was a good kid too. And he was really trying to get away from this thing. And a big part of the book focuses on his struggles to escape this world of smuggling, and the eventual failure to do that. He was someone who I was working with my first year of the project, and then soon after I left the field, was murdered by another smuggler that I had also been kind of working with. And so the book really revolves around his murder, and the way in which all these other people that I came to know, how their stories were sort of intertwined with his. But for me, he really represented what a lot of these folks look like. I mean, the smuggling industry is brutal. It's brutal to migrants, but it also is brutal to the people who decide to kind of get into it. I mean, and many of the smugglers live very, very short lives, unfortunately, because they are involved in these things that are so dangerous. And as many of them will say in the book, once you get in, it's really difficult to get out. And so, Roberto was someone whose story just deeply impacted me, changed my life in a lot of ways, as I was trying to understand, his experiences and the difficult decisions that he had been forced to make from a very, very early age, and just the kind of heartbreak that I witnessed watching someone just trying to do the right thing at the end of the day, and really just not being able to escape this, the hell that is, the world of human smuggling.
Many of these guides are quote unquote failed migrants themselves. Try to get
Yeah.
into the United States. Maybe they even did get into the United States, but once you get into the United States, now what? It's quite tough if you don't have the means to make it
Yep.
here.
So many of them had gone to the U.S. and failed. A lot of them too had come from these violent backgrounds where the only thing that they'd ever known was criminal activities, robbing, stealing, selling drugs, and they get to the U.S. and they try to go straight, but they don't have much of an education. They really struggle to kind of fit into society, and so a lot of them had trouble holding down straight jobs. They get deported for various reasons. And they find that, look, they've been kind of, so someone says at one point, I think in the book, like they've been trained their whole life for these kind of violent criminal activities. And so what else is there for them to do in the world? And for me, was a real heartbreaker too. The fact that so many of these folks, by the time they get to get involved in smuggling, there were never any other options really offered to them. That things were hard for them from the very beginning, and they just had few choices. And so the criminal underworld is the kind of the path of least resistance for them, just to be able to just make a couple of bucks. But unfortunately, that's a very unforgiving world.
Unforgiving world. You chronicle people who done horrible things, including committed murder. You've also chronicled people who see themselves as a guide, as, I don't want to put words in their mouths or your mouths, but it seems like God's work. And one of these people was by the name of Santos, that you named Santos in the book, I'm assuming.
Yep. Yeah. Santos is I picked that name for him because for me, he was the most saintly of all these, people that I worked with. And he was the one that I was just rooting for so much, because it was clear that he just had the worst luck and was always trying to do the right thing. And it didn't matter what he did. It just, the worst possible thing could happen to him. And he really, throughout the book and throughout his life, struggles to get away from these criminal activities. And, he'd been running away from gang life his entire life. And, yet he still ends up in prison at one point in the book, and all these other things that happened to him. Yeah, I mean, I think people I ended up meeting kind of ran the full spectrum. I mean, there were the folks who admittedly were like, I'm the worst of the worst. I am the bad guy. I've done all this kind of horrible stuff on one side of the tracks, and on the other side of the tracks, I'm trying to maybe redeem myself by helping these folks and acting as a guide and as a potential savior for these migrants. And then there are other folks who are like, look,
Trying
I'm
to
just
level
doing,
it out, trying to, hey, I've done
yeah,
these really bad things, so let me try to go do some of
yeah.
these. Because are
And
these
that was
folks
clear. I mean,
religious?
they're
Are they
definitely
religious? Are they thinking religiously?
100%.
Yeah.
There was lots of conversations about religion, about God, about doing the right thing. And then at the same time, these folks would then double cross a migrant. Um, but then there were folks like Santos who I think, he walked the walk, in a lot of ways. But people who are involved in smuggling, I think they represent the entire spectrum of that, of like the sort of righteous people trying to do the right thing, and then the people who are like, yeah, I'm making some money here, and if I help people out, that's great too. But at the end of the day, I need to get paid.
It's interesting, though, that you say that there's a lot of talk about religion. How does one reconcile with religion and then one of the more doing some of the more horrendous things, including murder?
Those people would say to me, um, only God can judge me, right? And if I have to kill someone, it's because they were going to kill me first. They were a bad person, and it was nothing personal. It was just about business. And then maybe through this other stuff, then smuggling then is perhaps a path of redemption. But there were lots of those conversations that happen all the time. I mean, a lot of these guys were surprisingly religious in these discussions about, forgiveness and about, their past and trying to get away from it and try to reform themselves. God and Jesus ended up playing huge roles in those conversations.
One of these guys that you write about, sort of fascinating, you name Payaso. Payaso, in English, translated into English, is clown. So in that way, it already sounds kind of scary.
Yeah.
And then he's a knitter. He
Yeah.
knits, which I mean, even scarier, I guess. I don't know. Tell me about Payaso.
Payaso is one of these enforcers who is not a smuggler, but he's a kind of hitman for the local gang in Pacalna. And so if you don't pay the head tax coming through, Payaso will find you and will do very bad things to you, including killing someone. In the book, I call him Payaso because he's not. It's like there's nothing funny about him, right? He has this nickname that it's a it's like the clown from It. I mean, he's just like this. He's
That's
just
what
a
I
very
thought of.
scary, like deadpan, kind of person who, yeah, who's just also like super into knitting. And all the knitting happens because these guys all spend time in prison, and knitting and doing handicrafts is a way for them to make some money by selling stuff to other inmates or to selling stuff kind of out on the street later on. So a lot of those guys pick up these crafts while being incarcerated. But I spent a lot of time with Payaso, and we got along really well. But it was just one of these things where, you're just deathly afraid of someone 100% all the time because you know what they're capable of. And with him, it was clear that it was cold-blooded. I mean, there was no animosity. It was just a job, and he was more than willing to do it. And he ends up getting arrested and sent to prison for murder for numerous murders. But then he would send me these pictures of things that he was making for me in prison that he was knitting, and these gifts that he wanted to give me, which was those were unsettling text messages.
Did you get them?
I did not. He made me a SpongeBob SquarePants handbag that I was never able to pick up partly because I have no desire to visit that. He's in this prison in southern Chiapas that just feels like it's probably not a good move for me to try to go and hang out there for any extended period of time.
The name of your book is Soldiers and Kings. Is there a significance to that title?
The soldiers represent all of these young guys, these grunts, these folks who are on the ground doing the kind of dirty work. Kings comes from the fact that all these Honduran guys, especially the higher ups, will refer to each other as my king, mi rey, and so it was this term that was thrown around quite a bit. But I use that term king partly because all of these kind of veteran smugglers try to present themselves as the most dominant, controlling, hyper masculine person in the room. I mean, it's just this air of like, I am the king. This is my kingdom. And yet all those guys live super precarious lives where they give off this idea that they're in control, but behind the scenes, it's a house of cards and things can fall apart incredibly quickly, and they can be destitute and out on the streets in a matter of days. And someone like there's a guy I read about named Kingston and a guy I read about named Flacco, who they go from being powerful, making tons of money, to suddenly, Kingston gets robbed and someone steals everything from his house, in the middle of the night, and he's just now on the streets.
You're with him.
I was with him when that happened.
That's
Yeah.
scary. Yeah.
And just the fact that he can go from having this lavish apartment with all this stuff in it to suddenly now someone has taken everything away was making it clear that these guys were just living, were really living hand to mouth in a lot of ways. And and Flacco, he goes from having 3 apartments across Mexico to sleeping on the concrete, in southern Chiapas, at the end of the story.
So there's a lot of money to be made, but fleeing success, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the money comes and goes. It's boom and bust. And these guys, you'll see them. They'll send me a picture with them with a gun and a big stack of money, and then in a week they're out on the streets again. They've blown all that money. They're begging for food. There's no consistency, I think, to this lifestyle.
Jason DeLeon has been our guest. Jason DeLeon is professor of anthropology and Chicano studies and director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also the executive director of Undocumented Migration Project and author of the book that he has joined us to talk about called Soldiers and Kings: Survival and Hope in the World of Human Smuggling. Jason DeLeon, I thank you very much for taking this time.
Mitch, thank you so much for having me.